The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 8, Side 2. The great library and the scholars whom it had attracted set the tone of Alexandrian literature. Books had to meet the tastes of a learned and critical audience, sophisticated by science and history. Even poetry became erudite, and tried to cover up the poverty of its fancy with recondite allusions and subtle turns of phrase. Callimachus wrote dead hymns to dead gods, pretty epigrams that sparkled for a day, judicious eulogies like the Lock of Berenice, and a didactic poem on causes, or aitia, which contained much learned lore from geography, mythology, and history, and one of the earliest love stories in literature. Acontius, hero of this tale, is incredibly handsome, and Cydippe is painfully beautiful. They fall in love at first sight, are opposed by their money-minded parents, threaten suicide, half die of broken hearts, and finally end the romance with marriage. This is the story that 1,000,000 poets and novelists have told since then, and which 1,000,000 more will tell. It must be added, however, that in one of his epigrams Callimachus returned to more orthodox Greek tastes. "Drink now and love, Democritus, for we shall not have wine and boys eternally." His only rival in his century was his pupil, Apollonius of Rhodes. When the student poached upon the master's verses and competed for the favor of the Ptolemies, the two men quarreled in life and print, and Apollonius returned to Rhodes. He proved his courage by writing, in an age that preferred brevity, a very passable epic, the Argonautica. Callimachus dismissed it with an epigram: "A big book is a big evil," of whose truth the reader may find an instance at close hand. In the end, Apollonius was rewarded. He received the coveted appointment of librarian, and even persuaded some of his contemporaries to read his epic. It still survives and contains an excellent psychological study of Medea's love, but it is not indispensable to a modern education. The rise of pastoral poetry betrays almost statistically the growth of an urban civilization. The Greeks of earlier centuries had said little about the beauty of the countryside because most of them had once lived on farms or near them, and knew the lonely hardships as well as the quiet beauty of rural life. Doubtless the Alexandria of the Ptolemies was as hot and dusty as Alexandria is today, and the Greeks who lived in it looked back with idealizing memory upon the hills and fields of their motherland. The great city was just the place to breed bucolic poetry. Thither came, about 276, a confident young man with the pleasant name of Theocritus. He had begun life in Sicily and had continued it in Kos. He had returned to Syracuse to seek the patronage of Hiram II, and had failed. But he could never forget the beauty of Sicily, its mountains and flowers, its coasts and bays. He moved to Alexandria, composed a panegyric on Ptolemy II, and won the passing favor of the court. For some years he seems to have lived amid royalty and scholarship, while his melodious pictures of country life made him popular among the sophisticates of the capital. His Praxinoa describes the terror of Alexandria's crowded streets. "Oh heavens, what a mob! I can't imagine how we're to squeeze through, or how long it'll take. An ant-heap is nothing to this hurly-burly. Oh, Gorgon, darling, look, what shall we do? The royal cavalry! Don't ride us down! Eunoa, get out of the way!" How could a man with the soul of a poet and memories of Sicily be happy in such an environment? He praised the king for bread, but fed his spirit on fancies of his native island, and perhaps of Kos. He envied the simple life of the shepherd, pacing with his placid animals grassy slopes overlooking sunny seas. In this mood he perfected the idyll, the idyllion, or little picture, and gave it the connotation that it keeps today of a rustic cameo or a poetic tale. Only 10 of the 32 pieces that have come down to us from Theocritus are pastoral poetry, but these have set a half-rural stamp upon the name that covers them all. Here at last nature entered Greek literature, not as a goddess merely, but as the living and lovable features of the earth. Never before had Greek literature conveyed so feelingly the secret sense of kinship that stirs the soul with gratitude and affection for rocks and streams, water and soil and sky. But another theme reaches even more deeply into the heart of Theocritus: romantic love. He is still a Greek, indites 2 lyrics to homosexual friendship, and tells with vivid sentiment the story of Heracles and Hylas, how the giant, who withstood the ferocity of the lion, loved a youth and taught him like a father everything by which he might become a good and illustrious man, nor would he leave the lad at dawn, or noon, or evening, but sought continually to fashion him after his own heart, and to make him a right yoke-fellow with him in mighty deeds. A more famous idyll rehearses Stesichorus's tale of Daphnis the Sicilian shepherd, who piped and sang so well that legend made him the inventor of bucolic, that is, cow-tending, poetry. For a while Daphnis watched his herd and envied their amorous play. When the first hair had sprouted on his lip, a divine nymph fell in love with him and had him for her mate. But as the price of her favors, she made him swear that he would never love another woman. He tried hard to keep his vow, and succeeded till a king's daughter became enamored of his youth and gave herself to him in the fields. Aphrodite saw it, and revenged her fellow goddess by making Daphnis waste away with unrequited love. As he died, he bequeathed his pipe to Pan in a song to which the narrator adds a haunting refrain. Master, approach. Take to thee this fair pipe, bedded in wax that breathes of honey still, bound at the lips with twine. For love has come to hale me off unto the house of death. Muses, forego, forego the pastoral song. Now let the briar and the thistle flower with violets, and the fair narcissus bloom on junipers. Let all things go awry, and pines grow pears, since Daphnis is for death. Let stags pursue the hounds, and from the hills the screeching owls outsing the nightingales. Muses, forego, forego the pastoral song. So said he then, no more. And Aphrodite was fain to raise him, but the destinies had spun his thread right out. So Daphnis went downstream, the whirlpool closed above his head, the head of him whom all the Muses loved, of him from whom the nymphs were not estranged. Muses, forego, forego the pastoral song. The second idyll continues the theme of love, but in a fiercer mood. Simetha, maid of Syracuse, seduced and deserted by Delphus, seeks to command his love by philters and charms. If she fails, she is resolved to poison him. Standing under the stars, she tells Selene, the goddess of the moon, with what hot jealousy she saw Delphus walking with his comrade. Scarce had we reached the midpoint of the road by the dwelling of Lycon, Delphus, when I beheld with Eudenippus advancing. Blonder of cheek and chin were the youths than yellowing ivy, yea, and their breasts far brighter of sheen than thou, O Selene, showing they just had come from the noble toil of the wrestlers. Think on my love, and think whence it came, thou Lady Selene. I, when I saw, how I raged, how the flame took hold of my bosom, burned my love-lost heart. My beauty waned, and no longer watched I the pomp as it passed, nor how I returned to my homestead knew I, for some fell bane, some parching disease had undone me. 10 days stretched on my bed, and 10 nights dwelt I in anguish. Think on my love, and think whence it came, thou Lady Selene. Often the bloom of my flesh grew dry and yellow as dye-wood, yea, and the hairs of my head fell off, and of all that I once was, naught but skin was left and bones. And to whom did I not turn, whose road left I unsought, where an old crone chanted a love charm? Still no solace I found, and time sped ever a-flying. Think on my love, and think whence it came, thou Lady Selene. The third idyll introduces us to the nymph Amaryllis and her unattainable charms, the fourth to the shepherd Corydon, the seventh to the poetic goatherd Lycidas, names destined to be invoked by 1,000 poets again from Virgil to Tennyson. These rustics are idealized and speak the most exquisite Greek. Any one of them can sing hexameters lovelier than Homer's. But we learn to accept their incredible gifts as a tolerable convention when we surrender to the plaintive lilt of their songs. Theocritus redeems their reality with the smell of their jackets and the occasional obscenity of their thoughts. A lusty vein of humor salts their sentiment and makes them men. All in all, this is the most perfect Greek poetry written after Euripides, the only extant Hellenistic verse that has the breath of life. 5. Polybius. If the Hellenistic age inspired but one great poet, it produced an unprecedented quantity and variety of prose. It invented the imaginary conversation, the essay, and the encyclopedia. It continued the tradition of writing brief and vivid biographies, and in the Roman sequel Greek literature would add the sermon and the novel. Oratory was a dying mode, for it had depended upon the game of politics, litigation before popular courts, and the democratic right to talk. The letter became a favorite vehicle for both communication and literature. Now were established the epistolary forms and phrases that we find in Cicero, and even the famous exordium dear to our grandfathers, hoping that this finds you as well as it leaves me. Historiography flourished. Ptolemy I, Aratus of Achaia, and Pyrrhus of Epirus wrote memoirs of their campaigns, establishing a tradition that culminated in Caesar. The Egyptian high priest Manetho wrote in Greek an Aegyptiaca, or Annals of Egypt, which bundled the pharaohs somewhat arbitrarily into those dynasties that classify them to this day. Berosus, high priest of the Chaldeans, dedicated to Antiochus I a history of Babylon based upon the cuneiform records. Megasthenes, ambassador of Seleucus I to Chandragupta Maurya, startled the Greek world about 300 with a book on India. "There is among the Brahmins," said a suggestive passage, "a sect of philosophers who hold that God is the word, by which they mean not articulate speech, but the discourse of reason." Here again was that doctrine of logos which was destined to make such an impress upon Christian theology. Timaeus of Tauromenium, having been exiled from Sicily by Agathocles in 317, traveled widely in Spain and Gaul, and then settled down in Athens to write a history of Sicily and the West. He was an industrious student, so anxious to include everything that some of his rivals called him an old rag-picker. He labored to arrive at an accurate chronology and hit upon the scheme of dating events by Olympiads. He criticized his predecessors severely and was lucky enough to die before seeing the brutal attack made upon his work by Polybius. The greatest of the Hellenistic historians, and the only Greek fit to make a triad with Herodotus and Thucydides, was born at Megalopolis in Arcadia in 208. His father, Lycortas, was one of the leading men of the Achaean League, being ambassador to Rome in 189 and Strategos in 184. The boy was brought up in the odor of politics, was trained as a soldier under Philopoemen, fought in the Roman campaign against the Gauls in Asia Minor, was associated with his father on an embassy to Egypt in 181, and was made the League's hipparchos, or commander of the cavalry, in 169. He paid for his prominence. When the Romans punished the League for supporting Perseus against them, they took 1,000 leading Achaeans to Rome as hostages, and Polybius was among them in 167. For 16 years he suffered exile, and at times, he tells us, utter loss of spirit and paralysis of mind. But the young Scipio befriended him, introduced him to the Scipionic circle of educated Romans, and persuaded the Senate, when it was scattering the other exiles throughout Italy, to let Polybius live with him in Rome. He accompanied Scipio on many campaigns, gave him valuable military advice, explored for him the coasts of Spain and Africa, and stood beside him at the burning of Carthage in 146. He had received his freedom in 151, and in 149 he was employed as the representative of Rome in arranging a modus vivendi between the cities of Greece and their distant master, the Roman Senate. He must have performed this ungrateful task well, for several cities honored him with monuments, though one can never tell in what tense man's gratitude is felt. Having lived through 60 full years of action, he retired to write a treatise on tactics, a life of Philopoemen, and his immense histories. He died like a gentleman by falling from his horse as he was returning from a hunt, at the age of 82. No man ever wrote history from a wider background of education, travel, and experience. His work was conceived on a grand scale, and proposed to tell the story not only of Greece but of the whole world, that is, the Mediterranean nations, from 221 to 146 B.C. Such is the plan I propose, but all depends upon fortune's granting me a life long enough to execute it. He rightly felt that the center of political history, in the period which he covered, lay in Rome. He gave his book Unity by making Rome the focus of its events, and studying with the diplomat's curiosity the methods by which Rome, with British casualness, had mastered the Mediterranean world. He admired the Romans intensely, for he had seen them in their greatest epoch, and had known chiefly the best of them in Scipio's group. They had, he felt, just those qualities that were fatally lacking in Greek character and government. Himself an aristocrat and befriended by aristocrats, he had no sympathy with what seemed to him mere mob rule in the later stages of Greek democracy. Political history appeared to him to be a repetitious cycle of monarchy or dictatorship, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and monarchy. The best escape from this cycle, he thought, was through a mixed constitution like that of Lycurgus or Rome, an enfranchised but limited citizenry, choosing its own magistrates, but checked by the power of a continuous and aristocratic Senate. It was from this viewpoint that he wrote down the record of his times. Polybius is the historian's historian because he is as interested in his method as in his subject. He likes to talk about his plan of procedure and philosophizes at every opportunity. Humanly, he pictures his own qualifications as ideal. He insists that history should be written by those who have seen, or have directly consulted others who have seen, the events to be described. He denounces Timaeus for having relied on his ears rather than his eyes, and tells with pride of his own travels in search of data, documents, and geographical veracity. He reminds us how, in returning from Spain to Italy, he crossed the Alps by the same pass that Hannibal had used, and how he went down into the very toe of Italy to decipher an inscription left by Hannibal in Brutium. He proposes to make his history as accurate as the magnitude of the work and its comprehensive treatment will allow, and he succeeds, so far as we can say, better than any other Greek except Thucydides. He argues that the historian should have been a man of affairs, versed in the actual processes of statesmanship, politics, and war. Otherwise, he will never understand the behavior of states or the course of history. He is a realist and a rationalist. He pierces the moral phrases of diplomats to the actual motives of policy. It amuses him to observe how easily men can be deceived, singly or en masse, and even repeatedly by the same tricks. What is good, says a scandalous presage of Machiavelli, very seldom coincides with what is advantageous, and few are those who can combine the two and adapt them to each other. He accepts the Stoic theology of a divine providence, but he merely pities the popular cults of his day and smiles at stories of supernatural intervention. He recognizes the role of chance in history and the occasional efficacy of great men, but he is resolved to lay bare the factual and often impersonal chain of causes and effects, so that history may be a lantern of understanding held up to the present and the future. There is no more ready corrective of conduct than knowledge of the past, and the soundest education and training for a life of active politics is the study of history. It is history, and history alone, which, without involving us in actual danger, will mature our judgment and prepare us to take right views, whatever may be the crisis or the posture of affairs. The best method of history, he thinks, will be that which sees the life of a nation as an organic unity and weaves the story of each part into the life history of the whole. He who believes that by studying isolated histories he can acquire a just view of history as a whole is, it seems to me, much in the case of one who, after having looked at the dissevered limbs of an animal once alive and beautiful, fancies he has been as good as an eyewitness of the creature itself in all its action and grace. Of the 40 books into which Polybius divided his histories, time has preserved 5, and the epitomists have rescued substantial fragments of the rest. It is a great pity that the execution of this vast conception is marred by degenerate Greek, peevish critiques of other historians, an almost exclusive preoccupation with politics and war, and an absurd segmentation of the narrative into Olympiads, giving the history of all the Mediterranean nations in each 4-year period and leading to exasperating digressions and a baffling discontinuity. Sometimes, as in the story of Hannibal's invasion, Polybius mounts to drama and eloquence, but he reacts so strongly against the florid rhetoric popular among his immediate predecessors that he makes it a point of honor to be dull. No one, said an ancient critic, ever read him through. The world has almost forgotten him, but historians will long continue to study him because he was one of the greatest theorists and practitioners of historiography, because he dared to take a wide view and write a universal history, and because, above all, he understood that mere facts are worthless except through their interpretation, and that the past has no value except as our roots and our illumination. Chapter 28. The Art of Dispersion. 1. A Miscellany. The decline of Greek civilization was longest deferred in the sphere of art. Here the Hellenistic age bears comparison not only in fertility but even in originality with any period in history. Certainly the minor arts suffered no deterioration. Skilled workers in wood, ivory, silver, and gold were scattered throughout the expanded Greek world. The engraving of gems and coins now reached its highest excellence. As far east as Bactria, Hellenized kings lavished art upon their currency, and in the west the decadrachma of Hiram II might be defended as the finest coin in numismatic record. Alexandria became famous for its goldsmiths and silversmiths, whose artistry revealed the faultless style of its poets. For its delightful cameos, precious stones or shells, carved in colored relief, for its blue or green faience, its skillfully glazed pottery, its delicately designed and many-colored glass. The Portland vase, very likely a product of Alexandria, shows this art at its best. Elegant figures cut into a layer of milk-white glass, superimposed upon a body of blue glass. This is, so to speak, the Josiah Wedgwood masterpiece of antiquity. Music remained popular in all classes of the population. Scales and modes changed in the direction of refinement and novelty. Transient discords were admitted into harmony. Instruments and compositions increased in complexity. Towards 240 at Alexandria, the old pipes of Pan were enlarged into an organ of bronze pipes, and about 175, Ctesibius improved this into an organ operated by a combination of water and air and enabling the player to control vast waves of sound. We know nothing more of its construction, but we shall see how rapidly it developed in Roman days into the organ of Christian and modern times. Instruments were combined into orchestras, and semi-symphonic performances of purely instrumental music, sometimes in 5 movements, were given in the theaters of Alexandria, Athens, and Syracuse. Professional virtuosos rose to great prominence and to a social standing commensurate with their high fees. About 318, Aristoxenus of Taras, a pupil of Aristotle, wrote a small treatise, Harmonics, which became the classic ancient text in musical theory. Aristoxenus was a very serious man, and like most philosophers, he did not enjoy the music of his time. Athenaeus represents him as saying, in words that many generations have heard, "We also, since the theaters have become completely barbarized, and since music has become utterly ruined and vulgar, we, being but a few, will recall to our minds, sitting by ourselves, what music used to be." The architecture of the Hellenistic age cannot impress us, for time has leveled it away with indiscriminate hostility. And yet we know, from literature and remains, that the Greek building art spread its sway in this period from Bactria to Spain. The mutual influence of Greece and the Orient brought in a mixture of styles. The colonnade and the architrave invaded Inner Asia, while the arch, the vault, and the cupola entered the West. Even so ancient an Hellenic center as Delos raised Egyptian and Persian capitals. The Doric order seemed too stern and stiff for an age that loved refinement and ornament. It gave ground city by city, while the ornate Corinthian style advanced to its highest excellence. The secularization of art kept pace with the secularization of government, law, morals, letters, and philosophy. Stoas, porticos, marketplaces, courts, assembly rooms, libraries, theaters, gymnasiums, and baths began to crowd out the temples, and regal or private palaces gave a new outlet to Greek design and decoration. Domestic interiors were adorned with paintings, statues, and wall reliefs. Private gardens surrounded the more palatial homes. Royal parks, gardens, lakes, and pavilions were built in the capitals and were usually opened to public use. Town planning developed as a sister art to architecture. Streets were laid out on Hippodamus's rectangular scheme, with main avenues as wide as 30 feet, an ample width for horse and chariot days. Smyrna boasted of paved thoroughfares, but presumably most Hellenistic streets were trampled dirt and knew all the vicissitudes of mud. Fine buildings developed beyond any precedent. At Athens, in the 2nd century, the lofty Corinthian columns of the Olympium were set up, and the general design of the extended edifice, the most magnificent in Athens, was laid down by the Roman architect Cassius, a strange inversion of Rome's usual dependence upon the artists of Greece. Livy described this temple of the Olympian Zeus as the only structure he had seen that could be a fit dwelling for the god of gods. 16 columns of it stand, the most beautiful existing specimens of the Corinthian style. At Eleusis, the dying piety of Athens and the genius of Philon completed the majestic temple of the Mysteries, which Pericles had begun on a site already sacred in Mycenaean times. Only fragments are left, but some of them show Greek design and carving still at their best. At Delos, the French have excavated the ground plan of Apollo's sanctuary, and have revealed a city once crowded with edifices devoted to commerce or the protection of 100 Greek or foreign gods. At Syracuse, Hiram II raised many impressive buildings and restored and enlarged the extant municipal theater. To this day we may read his name on its stones. In Egypt, the Ptolemies adorned Alexandria with edifices that gave the city a reputation for beauty, but no sign of them survives. Ptolemy III erected at Edfu a temple which is the noblest architectural relic of the Grecian occupation, and his successors built or rebuilt the temple of Isis at Philae. In Ionia, new homes were given to the gods at Miletus, Priene, Magnesia, and elsewhere. The third temple of Artemis at Ephesus was finished about 300 B.C. A still vaster fane was raised by the architects Paeonius and Daphnis at Didyma, near Miletus, in honor of Apollo, 332 B.C. to A.D. 41. Some drums of the superb Ionic columns still remain. At Pergamum, Eumenes II made his capital the talk of Greece by building, among many noble structures, that famous altar to Zeus which the Germans exhumed in 1878 and have skillfully reconstructed in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. A majestic flight of steps mounted between two porticos to a spacious colonnaded court, and around 130 feet of the base ran a frieze as supreme in its period as that of the Mausoleum in the 4th century or the Parthenon in the 5th. Never had Greece been so handsomely adorned, and never had the enthusiasm of its citizens and the skill of its artists transformed with such splendor so many habitations of men. 2. Painting. Painting is usually the last great art to mature in a civilization. In the early stages of a culture, it is subordinated to religious architecture and statuary, and it acquires independence only when private life and private wealth invite the decoration of the home or the commemoration of a name. The death of democracy having weakened the sense of the state, the individual returned to domestic consolations. Rich men built themselves palatial residences and gave high fees to artists who could adorn a fountain or brighten a wall. Alexandria used painting on glass as one form of mural ornament. All Hellenistic cities employed for this purpose movable panels of wood. Princes and magnates preferred to have immense pictures painted on detachable marble slabs. Pausanias describes a prodigious number of paintings seen by him in his tour of Greece, but nothing of this flourishing art has cheated time except some faded tints on pottery or stone. We are left to guess at its quality from the pale and middling copies found at Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Rome. Greece continued to rank its painters as high as its sculptors and architects, perhaps higher. It paid them American commissions and told 1,000 fond stories about their lives. Tesicles of Ephesus, failing to receive a desired boon from Queen Stratonice, painted her romping with a fisherman, exhibited the picture, and then took ship to safety. Stratonice, because the likenesses of the two figures were so admirably expressed, forgave him and let him return. When Aratus took Sicyon, he ordered all portraits of its past dictators destroyed. One dictator, Archestratus, had been shown by Melanthus, a 4th-century painter, beside his chariot, and so vividly that the artist Neocles entreated Aratus to spare the picture. Aratus consented, on condition that the figure of Archestratus be replaced by some less offensive form. Protogenes, says Strato, painted a satyr with a partridge so realistically that live partridges called to it. The painter finally blotted out the bird so that people might appreciate the excellence of his satyr. The same artist, Pliny tells us, applied 4 coats of paint to his most famous picture, Ialyssus, supposed founder of the town of that name in Rhodes, so that when time wore out the uppermost layer the colors might still be fresh and clear. Vexed by his inability to represent with sufficient verisimilitude the foam that dripped from the mouth of Ialyssus's dog, Protogenes lost his temper and hurled a sponge at the picture, willing to destroy it. The sponge, of course, stuck just at the right place, and when it fell, left a blotch of color marvelously like the foam of a panting hound. When Demetrius Poliorcetes besieged Rhodes, he refrained from setting fire to the town lest this painting be destroyed. During the siege, Protogenes continued at work in his village studio, in the direct line of the Macedonian advance. Demetrius sent for him and asked why he had not, like the other villagers, taken refuge within the city walls. "Because I know," answered Protogenes, "that you are waging war with the Rhodians and not with the arts." The king assigned a guard to protect him and neglected the siege to watch the artist work. Hellenistic painters knew the tricks of perspective, foreshortening, lighting, and grouping, though they used landscapes only as background and decoration, and rendered them, if we may judge from the Pompeian copies, in a lifeless and conventional way. They at least realized the existence of nature, and brought it into art at the same time that Theocritus was importing it into poetry. But they were so interested in man and all his works that they had little time for trees and flowers. Their predecessors had painted only the gods and the rich. The Hellenistic artists were fascinated by anything human, and discovered that an ugly subject might make a beautiful painting, or at least a handsome fee. They turned to common life with a Dutch zest, and delighted in picturing barbers, cobblers, prostitutes, seamstresses, donkeys, deformed men, or peculiar animals. To these genre pictures they added representations of still life, cakes and eggs, fruit and vegetables, fish and game, wine, and all the paraphernalia of its ancient ritual. Sosus of Pergamum amused his contemporaries by imitating in a deceptively realistic floor mosaic an unswept floor still littered with the leavings of a feast. The sedate were scandalized and denounced these glorifiers of common things as pornographoi and riporographoi, portrayers of obscenity and filth. In Thebes, the representation of ugly objects was forbidden by law. Certain larger masterpieces of the age were rescued not from anonymity but from oblivion by the lava of Vesuvius. A fresco found at Ostia is apparently a weak copy of a Hellenistic original. We know it as the Aldobrandini wedding from the Italian family to which it belonged before it found a place in the Vatican. Aphrodite, Rubensianly robust, warms up the courage of the timid bride while the bridegroom, needing no prodding, waits impatiently beside the couch. Finer than these central personages is a graceful woman playing some hymeneal strain on a faded lute. A Pompeian mural, traced uncertainly to a 3rd-century Greek original, shows Achilles, with Patroclus beside him, angrily surrendering Briseis to Agamemnon's lust. The figures in these paintings seem to our wanton taste more ample than beautiful. We are accustomed to less body and longer legs, but it must be conceded that ancient artists knew Greek men and women better than we shall ever know them. Time has taken the bloom from these works. Only an active historical imagination can restore the brilliance and freshness that doubtless were once the admiration of multitudes and kings. More impressive are certain Roman mosaics that have apparently been derived from Hellenistic paintings. Mosaic was an old art in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Greeks took it over and lifted it to the peak of its history. A painting was divided by lines into little squares, and tiny cubes of marble were so colored that when put together they reproduced the picture in a form surprisingly durable. Several mosaics, though trodden by innumerable feet through many centuries, still retain their color and tell their ancient tale. The Battle of Issus, found in the House of the Faun at Pompeii, and dubiously connected with a 4th century Greek painting by Philoxenus, is composed of approximately 1,500,000 stones, each some 2 or 3 millimeters square, the whole mosaic measuring 8 by 16 feet. It was badly injured by the earthquake and eruption that overwhelmed Pompeii in AD 79, but enough remains to attest the skill and vigor of the work. Alexander, black and disheveled with the heat and filth of war, is leading the attack and has ridden his Bucephalus to within a few feet of the chariot that carries Darius. A Persian grandee has flung himself between the kings and has received Alexander's lance in his body. Darius, ignoring his own danger, for the conqueror's next lance is aimed at him, leans from his chariot towards his fallen friend, his face full of anxiety and grief. Persian cavalrymen rush up to rescue their ruler, and Alexander's weapon stays poised in the air. The representation of complex emotions in Darius's face is the outstanding accomplishment of the work, but the most attractive head in the composition is that of Alexander's horse. There is no greater mosaic than this. 3. Sculpture. Never has statuary been more abundant than in the Hellenistic age. Temples and palaces, homes and streets, gardens and parks were crowded with it. Every phase of human life and many aspects of the plant and animal world were represented in it. Portrait busts immortalized for a moment dead heroes and living celebrities. At last, even abstractions like fortune, peace, calumny, or the nick of time became concrete in stone. Eutychides of Sicyon, a pupil of Lysippus, molded for Antioch a famous Tyche, or fortune, to serve as the incarnation of the city's soul and hope. The sons of Praxiteles, Timachus and Cephisodotus, carried on the refined tradition of Athenian sculpture, and in the Peloponnesus, Damophon of Messene scaled the heights of fame with the colossal group of Demeter, Persephone, and Artemis. But most of the new sculptors followed the line of least starvation to the palaces and courts of Greco-Oriental magnates and kings. Rhodes, in the 3rd century, developed a school of sculpture characteristically its own. There were 100 colossal statues in the city, any of which, says Pliny, would have made a city famous. The greatest of them was the bronze colossus of the sun god Helios, set up in successive blocks by Chares of Lindus about 280. Chares, says a naive tradition, committed suicide when the cost seriously exceeded his estimate, and Laches, also of Lindus, completed the work. It did not bestride the harbor, but rose near it to a height of 105 feet. Its dimensions might suggest that Rhodian taste ran to display and size, but perhaps the Rhodians proposed to use it as a lighthouse and a symbol. If we may believe a poem in the Greek anthology, the statue held a light aloft and symbolized the freedom that Rhodes enjoyed, a curious anticipation of a famous statue in a modern port. The Statue of Liberty is 151 feet high from base to torch. It was, of course, included among the 7 wonders of the world. This statue, Pliny reported, was thrown down by an earthquake 56 years after it was erected. Few men can clasp the thumb in their arms, and its fingers are larger than most statues. When the limbs are broken asunder, vast caverns are seen yawning in the interior. Within it, too, are to be seen large masses of rock by whose weight the artist steadied it while in process of erection. It is said that it was 12 years in the making, and that 300 talents were spent upon it, a sum raised from the engines of war abandoned by Demetrius after his futile siege. Almost as famous in history was another product of the Rhodian school, the Laocoon. Pliny saw it in the palace of the Emperor Titus. It was found in the ruins of the Baths of Titus in A.D. 1506, and is almost certainly the original work of Agesander, Polydorus, and Athenodorus, who carved it out of 2 blocks of marble in the 2nd or 1st century B.C. Its discovery stirred Renaissance Italy and profoundly impressed Michelangelo, who tried without success to restore the lost right arm of the central figure. Laocoon was a Trojan priest who, when the Greeks sent the wooden horse to Troy, advised against receiving it, saying, says Virgil, Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes, I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts. To punish his wisdom, Athena, who favored the Greeks, commissioned 2 serpents to kill him. They seized first upon his 2 sons, seeing which Laocoon rushed to their aid only to be caught in the coils. In the end all 3 were crushed and died from the venom of the fangs. The sculptors took the liberty assumed by Virgil, and in the Philoctetes by Sophocles, to describe pain vigorously, but the result does not accord with the natural repose of stone. In literature, and usually in life, pain passes. In the Laocoon, the cry of agony has been given an unnatural permanence, and the spectator is not so moved as by Demeter's silent grief. What nevertheless evokes our admiration is the mastery of design and technique. The musculature is exaggerated, but the old priest's limbs and the bodies of his sons are molded with dignity and restraint. Perhaps if we had known the story before seeing the group, we should have been as impressed as Pliny, who thought this the greatest achievement of ancient plastic art. Many other Greek centers had flourishing schools of sculpture in this underestimated age. Alexandria turned over its soil and its buildings too often in the long course of its history to preserve the works that Greek artists made for the Ptolemies. The sole important survivor is the serene Nile of the Vatican, humorously supported by 16 water babies symbolizing the 16 cubits of the river's annual rise. At Sidon, Greek sculpture cut for unknown dignitaries a series of sarcophagi, of which the best, misnamed the sarcophagus of Alexander, is the pride of the Constantinople Museum. Its carving is equal on a smaller scale to that of the Parthenon frieze. The figures are handsome and well-proportioned, the action is vigorous but clear, and the soft tints that still cling to the stone exemplify the aid that Greek painting gave to Greek sculpture. At Tralles in Caria, about 150 B.C., Apollonius and Toriscus cast for Rhodes a colossal bronze group now known as the Farnese bull. Two handsome youths are lashing the lovely Dirce to the horns of a wild bull, because she has ill-treated their mother Antiope, who looks on in repulsively calm satisfaction. At Pergamum, Greek sculptors cast in bronze several battle groups, which Attalus first dedicated in his capital to celebrate his repulse of the Gauls. To express the debt which all Greek culture felt to Athens, and perhaps to spread his fame, Attalus presented marble replicas of these figures to be set up on the Athenian Acropolis. Fragmentary marble copies have survived in the dying Gaul of the Capitoline Museum, in the miscalled Petus and Aria, a Gaul who, preferring death to capture, kills first his wife and then himself, and in several smaller pieces now scattered through Egypt and Europe. Perhaps to the same group belongs a dead Amazon, impeccably molded in every detail except the incredibly perfect breasts. These figures show a classic restraint in the expression of emotion. The conquered men suffer the extremes of pain and grief, but die without opera, and the conquerors have allowed the artists to portray the virtues as well as the defeat of their enemies. There is no sign here of any falling off in power of conception, accuracy of anatomical observation, or skill and patience of technique. Almost as perfect is the great relief that ran along the base of the altar of Zeus on the Acropolis of Pergamum, and told again the story of the war between the gods and the giants, presumably a modest allegory for Pergamines and Gauls. The work is overcrowded and sometimes theatrically violent. But some figures stand out as in the best tradition of Greek art. The headless Zeus is carved with the strength of Scopas, and the goddess Hecate is a lyric of grace and beauty amid the terror and carnage of war. The age was rich in now anonymous masterpieces that almost call the roll of the major gods. The majestic head of Zeus found at Tricoli, and the Ludovisi Hera, now in the Museo delle Terme, so pleased the young Goethe that he took casts of them with him to Germany as, so to speak, the authentic autographs of Jove and Juno. The once acclaimed Apollo Belvedere is academically cold and lifeless, and yet 2 centuries ago it set Winkelmann aflame. A world away from this smooth weakling is the Farnese Heracles, copied by Glycon of Athens from an original attributed to Lysippus. All muscle in the overdone body, all weariness, kindliness, and wonder in the face, as if power was asking itself its never-answered question, what should be its goal? Of Aphrodite, the age had representatives only less numerous than her devotees. Several of these statues have survived, mostly through Roman copies. The Aphrodite of Milos, the Venus de Milo of the Louvre, is apparently an original Greek work of the 2nd century B.C. It was found on the island of Milos in 1820 near a pedestal fragment bearing the letters Sandros, S-A-N-D-R-O-S. Perhaps Agesander of Antioch carved this modest nudity. The face is not as delicately fair as that which forms the symbol of this volume, but the figure itself is a poem of that health whose natural flower is beauty. The wasp waist finds no encouragement in this full body and these sturdy hips. Not so near perfection, but still pleasant to the eye, are the Capitoline Venus and the Venus de Medici. Candidly and disarmingly sensual is the Venus Callipyge, or Venus of the lovely buttocks, who drapes her charms to reveal them and turns to admire her nates in the pool. More impressive than any of these is the superb Nike, or Victory of Samothrace, found there in 1863, and now the sculptural masterpiece of the Louvre. The goddess of victory is shown as if alighting in full flight upon the prow of a swiftly moving ship and leading the vessel on to attack. Her great wings seem to pull the craft along in the face of the breeze that confuses her robes. Again, the Greek conception of woman as no mere delicacy, but as a strong mother, dominates the work. This is not the frail and passing beauty of youth, but the lifelong call of the woman to the man to lift himself up to achievement, as if the artist had wished to illustrate the last lines of Goethe's Faust. The civilization that could conceive and carve this figure was yet far from dead. The gods were not the chief interest of the sculptors who brightened the evening of Greek art. These men looked upon Olympus as a quarry of subjects and no more. When that quarry had been worn down by repetition, they turned to the earth and took delight in representing the wisdom and loveliness, the strangeness and absurdities of human life. They carved or cast impressive heads of Homer, Euripides, and Socrates. They made a number of smooth and delicate hermaphrodites, whose equivocal beauty arrests the eye in the Archaeological Museum at Constantinople, or the Borghese Gallery in Rome, or the Louvre. Children offered refreshingly natural poses, like the boy who removes a thorn from his foot, and another who struggles with a goose. And, finest of this class, the trustful praying youth attributed to Lysippus's pupil Boethus. Or the sculptors went to the woods and depicted sylvan sprites like the Barberini faun of Munich, or the hilarious satyrs like the drunken Silenus of the Naples Museum. And here and there, with jolly frequency, they inserted among their figures the rosy cheeks and impish pranks of the god of love. 4. Commentary. This sudden eruption of humor into the once formal sanctuaries of Greek sculpture is a distinctive mark of Hellenistic art. Every museum has preserved from the ruins of the age some laughing faun, some singing Pan, some rioting Bacchus, some urchin serving as a fountain with alarming indecency. Perhaps the return of Greek art to Asia restored to it the variety, feeling, and warmth which it had almost lost in its classic subordination to religion and the state. Nature, which had been adored, now began to be enjoyed. Not that classic moderation disappeared. The youth of Subiaco in the Museo delle Terme, the sleeping Ariadne of the Vatican, the sitting maiden of the Palace of the Conservatori, continue the delicate tradition of Praxiteles. And in Athens, throughout this period, many sculptors fought the modernistic tendencies of their time by deliberately going back to 4th and 5th century styles, even now and then to the archaic dignity of the 6th. But the spirit of the age was for experiment, individualism, naturalism, and realism, with a strong countercurrent toward imagination, idealism, sentiment, and dramatic effect. Artists carefully followed the progress of anatomy and worked more from models in studios. Sculptors carved their figures to be seen not only from in front but from all sides. They used novel materials, crystal, chalcedony, topaz, glass, dark basalt, black marble, porphyry, to imitate the pigment of Negroes or the ruddy faces of satyrs illumined with wine. Their fertility of invention equaled their mastery of technique. They were tired of repeating types, they anticipated Ruskin's criticism, and were resolved to show the reality and individuality of the persons and objects they portrayed. This book is continued on Cassette 9, Side 1.